Good evening to everybody. A very warm welcome to Professor William Watkin, who traveled with a very boring journey, as he just told me, from London just to be with us this evening, as well as to the participants of the workshop, The Philosophy of Indifference, that will take place tomorrow, as well as, of course, to the organizers by the graduate school, Practices of Literature, and in particular to Hector Feliciano, and of course to all the colleagues and dear students who are joining this lecture this evening. My name is Franziska Dübken. I'm professor of philosophy here at the University of Münster and part of the Cluster of Excellence, Religion, Politics, who is hosting this event in collaboration with the graduate school Practices of Literature. This evening lecture is a follow-up event to the summer school entitled Tacet at Libitum, Towards the Poetics and Politics of Silence, which took place with a great success last July here in Münster and which was organized by several doctoral students of the graduate school Practices of Literature. The summer school focused from an interdisciplinary perspective on silence and its aporias, on the ways silence can be a sign of oppression as well as of resistance, a sign of resignation as well as political subversion, a sign of passivity as well as an active gesture. It brought together ethical, aesthetic, and political approaches to the topic, and researchers from different countries and theoretical proveniences. This evening's lecture develops a philosophy of silence and highlights the paradox which is operative at the heart of a philosophy which Professor Watkin calls Sigetics. I hope I pronounce it correctly. Namely, how to name the unnameable or how to say the unsayable. In his genealogy of Sigetics, Professor Watkin combines a rereading of the locus of difference in classical philosophy with post-structuralist thought that is challenging this binary thinking. He has extensively engaged with the thought of Giorgio Agamben and Alain Badiou, and will discuss this evening and also particularly tomorrow in the workshop his own approach, which is entitled A Philosophy of Indifference, where he engages with Agamben and Badiou, but also with many other modern post-structuralist thinkers like Derrida, Deleuze, Foucault, and other intellectuals. I'm very grateful to you, Professor Watkin, that you accepted this invitation. And at this moment, I would like to introduce you to those who are not familiar yet with your work. Professor Watkin holds a chair with the denomination Contemporary Philosophy and Literature at Brunel University in West London. There, he's director of the Research for Arts and Humanities and specialized in contemporary European philosophy. In his published work, he particularly focuses on notions such as biopolitics, indifference, and violence. He has extensively worked on contemporary poetry and poetics, and in his work he explores the relationship between poetry and philosophy. Professor Watkin is currently engaging, at least his webpage is documenting this, with the oeuvre of Jean-Luc Nancy, Alain Badiou, and Gilles Deleuze with regard to his philosophy of indifference. I will name just two of his many, I think it's 7 monographs that he published and that will be subject of tomorrow's workshop. The first is entitled Agamben and Indifference, a critical review and a critical overview, which was published in 2014 with Roman and Littlefield, and Badiou and Indifferent Being, a critical introduction to being and event, published 2017 with Bloomsbury Press. Besides this very impressive intellectual productivity as an academic, Professor Watkin is also a filmmaker, painter, blogger, and journalist. Some of you have the fortune to discover these sites of him tomorrow, since he promised to make reference to the fields of arts and literature in the realm of the workshop. Thanks for having made this journey to join us here in Münster. Thank you for introducing us to your philosophy of Sigetics and its interrelation to the philosophy of indifference. And thank you for being here with us this evening. A particular thanks also to Hector Feliciano for organizing this event. I know it is always challenging, both quite stressful and exciting, to put such an event together. And I really admire the enthusiasm and energy with which you and your colleagues from the graduate school embrace this idea from the very beginning, which the Cluster of Excellence is very happy to support from an institutional side. However, I do not want to take any more of your space and time at this moment. Practice myself in silence and listen to your reflections on the philosophy of silence. The floor is yours, Professor Watkin.
Thanks, Francisca, for that. Hector, have you pressed record? Is this working? A lot of high-level technical. Yes, wow, that's good. I'm going to say that Sigetics is the correct pronunciation, but I'm going to call it Sigetics because I can't get out of, once you've got it in your mind, you can't change it. Okay. The most important text in the canon of Sigetic works is surely Wittgenstein's Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, where he concludes that philosophical language has an exterior unsayability which is mystical, poetic and value-laden, but beyond the truth-preserving extensional propositions of logical language. The unsayability of philosophy is what philosophers have to be silent about. It's what philosophers cannot say. If Sigetics is the philosophically unsayable, it's also the unnameable, according to Badiou's important repositioning of the work, which I think is something slightly different. But staying with Wittgenstein a little longer, but now in the company of our silent partner, Alain Badiou, propositions, they say, are combinations of objects which, because they're atomic and tautological, cannot be thought or said. These objects break Leibniz's principle of indiscernibles. They are different, yet they can't be differentiated through modes of discerning up until they're thinkable as objects in a proposition by virtue of the fact that we have given them names. Now, names fix objects into propositions so that one can describe situations. But these situations themselves can't be named because they are not atomic. They are combinations of names, according to Wittgenstein. Finally, the names you choose to give to objects are indifferent and content neutral. In Notes on Logic, Wittgenstein states, A, this might be a shock to you, A is the same letter as A, great quote, meaning that truth in a proposition can only be shown. For example, that the letter A is the same kind of letter as B in this proposition. What A is saying in a proposition is nothing. It's just part of a logical picture of a possible state of affairs in the actual world. The letter A in this picture is in fact silent. It does not speak. So, inspired by Wittgenstein's extensional Sigetics, we can state that there are two things that philosophy has to be silent about: what an utterance as a whole cannot say, and what its units of expression cannot name. Across multiple thinkers of Sigetics, there is remarkable agreement that the unsayable in philosophy is language as such, expressible by a combination of two Sigetic axioms. Wittgenstein's famous, whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent, and Heidegger's equally famous and enigmatic language never has the floor. Language, in different ways, determines the truths of both extensional and phenomenological deconstructive thinking, such that the element philosophy cannot think is thought's actual element, language, while what philosophy cannot name is exteriority, or the object. Names do not speak, they simply hold objects in place in sentences. Thus, silence is effectively the name given to what is outside of thought, in terms of what is outside its linguistic capabilities, and also in terms of what is outside of language entirely, the world. Sigetics, the philosophy of the murmured external. Heideggerian Sigetics, as mapped out in Contributions to Philosophy, is primarily concerned with the unsayability of language as the medium for an encounter with the event of being. Being, in the archaic spelling in English with the Y, concerns the activity of bearing silence. He says the laws of bearing silence are higher than those of logic. Yet Sigetics is still a kind of logic, that of beingness, as the basic of experience of being before logic, but still in language. This is a kind of primal experience of bearing silence, is not that of a proposition any more than it is mathematical or indeed dialectical. Sigetics is characterized by a certain ontological restraint when being encounters the withdrawal of truth. Quote, when this restraint reaches words, what is said is always an event. The saying that bears silence is what grounds. End of quote. The naming process of bearing silence is particular in this respect. It's not a sign for something other than being, but names what is meant or names meaning as such. Now, how it does this is surely by showing meaning, in that pure meaning as such, as we saw, is outside of language. He concludes, bearing silence arises out of the essentially occurring origin of language itself. This is another axiom of Sigetics. Silence is the origin of speaking. It is the when of language never having the floor, and the there of where that floor is, the medium of language as language before division, before speaking, before naming. Such a taking place of language before expression, historically, has been called the pure medium of the semiotic, and is often described as rhythm or music. It's the natural habitat of poetry. The poem, indeed, for Wittgenstein and Heidegger is one potential Sigetic solution to the murmured external of thought. More recently, this function of language as pure medium has come to be called the presentation of presentation as such in Agamben and Badiou, for example. Pure presentation is inarticulate and dumb. It stays speechless so that the words it presents can speak. It is present in every utterance as the possibility that you can make an utterance. A possibility it can never say, only show by virtue of the fact that you are speaking at all. Bearing silence, Heidegger's Sigetics, has a specific role to play in what Heidegger calls inceptual thinking. So inceptual thought is a kind of meditation that occurs before basic conceptual philosophical tradition of thinking, say, subject-object relations, or the con-with of thinking. The prefixes alone, in English at least, are sufficient here to express the innovation that Heidegger is attempting. Concept means to take or capture something with. Inception, of course, means to begin, but specifically in the sense of to negate taking, to not take or not capture. In that inception is then followed by taking and capture with. What defines the inceptual is that it does not take with because it is the very first taking. It's really remarkable to me how similar inceptual Sigetics is to Badiou's set theoretical ontology. For example, if you're interested, the pre-relational nature of inceptual Sigetics is called the radical non-relationality of the void as indifferent by Badiou. It precedes exceeds and is in fact in non-relation to the entire discourse of relationality, what Agamben calls metaphysical diaresis, or thinking together as always oppositional. While the discussion of the first taking of inceptualism would be called a non-successor multiple in set theory. The number one, for example, which is an empty set, but also infinite sets. Heidegger's Sigetics, it transpires, is rather easily mapped onto Badiou's ontology of the void as non-relational and non-successive, or it takes, but it does not take with. It's the first capture of being, basically, for both thinkers, and helps us to appreciate that Badiou's ontology is a silent science. Inceptual thinking is pre-conceptual. We could say it's the neutral, raw material of thought. It allows us to think the commencement of the event of being before the logic of things like precedence, causality, or difference. It does so because it is the eventing of language, language as the floor, as neutral medium, pure presentation, and so on. By the time we name Sigetics as such in conceptual logic, for example, we've kind of murdered its essence by pigeonholing it. Thus, Sigetics, the philosophy of silence, is nameless, or perhaps more accurately, anonymous. This anonymity captures how a word can speak by being silent, how it can name without naming any specific thing. If inceptual thought bears silence by not taking, it's because it constitutes the limit of thinking being at the level of the unsayable nature of our language as such. Sigetics is the hushed floor of language. Giorgio Agamben's first major work, in my opinion, Language and Death, The Place of Negativity, 1982, I was 12, is a critique of the role of the ineffable in the philosophy of difference typified by Hegel, Heidegger, and by implication, Derrida. Now, ineffable in English means too great to be spoken of, which locates the book as a major development in the philosophy of Sigetics. It engages with Heidegger's work by taking the term Sigetics back to its very early roots. Agamben traces the figure of the Sige to the enigmatic canon of 2nd century Gnosticism, which tries to come to terms, as many of us have, with God's unspeakability. The Valentinian gnosis, for example, in speaking of the abyss as incomprehensible, unformed, and eternally pre-existence, contains within it, he says, a thought that is silent. As he evacuates his source material, Agamben comes to realize that silence, quote, comprehends the abyss as incomprehensible. Without Sige and its silent thought, the abyss could not even have been considered incomprehensible or unspeakable, he says. Now, what the Gnostics are grappling with is the ground of thought, how to think thought, and of course, the speakability of language as the medium of thought. Sige reminds one very much of the silence bearing of inceptual thinking in Heidegger, does it not? Inceptual in the abyssal sense of unformed, yet it is form. Inceptual because it is incomprehensible, yet Sige makes incomprehensibility comprehensible to us as a concept, meaning it can be thought in the negative by accepting that there's always an element of thought that is unsayable. And finally, Sige is, quote, eternally pre-existent, yet, a point Heidegger himself makes re-inceptualism, always available but only retrospectively. Sigetics is reaching for a foundation that is pre-foundational, a language that is unspeakable, and a thought that is incomprehensible as the basis of foundational sentences about the thinkability of thought itself as an unspeakable, non-founding foundation and, quote, ungroundedness from which a silent voice calls out. Agamben relates the ancient Sige to the foundation of modern philosophy of difference via Hegel's considerations of being, sense certainty, and deixis in terms of the experience of the immediate singularity of the now. Now, the word now names a singular moment, yet in naming singularity, the name becomes a deictic indicator, diese, or this. Every time you say now, you mean something singular, which is also indistinct. This is really the problem of linguistic mediation. You need to be able to express the immediate now, for example, to differentiate from other nows, such that it can be part of the set called nows. Yet as you do this using deictic anaphora, you negate the essence of what you want to say. In saying now, nowness becomes unsayable in its truthful essence, and the word now becomes generalized, just another now. Extrapolate out from this, say, via Wittgenstein, and you can see that all names are effectively shifters from specificity to a kind of generic indication, or the fact that all names function in precisely the same indistinct and unspecified manner. Replace now with that letter A, and you discover the shifting effect is the result of Hegel being unable to differentiate showing and saying. Hegel's now tries to show temporal immediacy through referential naming or saying, and as soon as he does this, he kills the essence of the now. It's a paradox that much concerns Derrida's Sigetics of the event. The paradox of modes of immediacy that, however, have to be mediated is particularly significant when it comes to the role of the voice in speaking my authentic being across the Western tradition, Agamben explains. It's an important moment in the history of thought, of course, because deconstruction began by deconstructing phonocentrism, first in Husserlian phenomenology and Derrida's speech and phenomenon, and then, of course, structural linguistics, famously in of grammatology. Now, Derrida's complaint is that there is an assumed immediacy between voice and truth or meaning. Writing, our form of mediation, lacks this authentic access to self-present being, so is seen in the tradition as somewhat supplementary. Interestingly, it's not the sound of the voice that supports phonologocentrism. For example, Derrida's attack on Husserl concerns the silent inner voice of your authentic self. It is, in other words, as Agamben's title suggests, rather the location of the ineffable that matters. It is the place of negativity. And that place, according to Agamben, is not fixed, but endlessly mobile. The silent A in Derrida's famous neologism, différence, for example, locates being in a restlessness between differing and deferral, due to the failure of the phone to capture being in full. When the voice speaks being, there's always a component of being that is unsayable, because it can be said, not because it is ineffable. Derrida learns this lesson, I think, from Heidegger's work, Identity and Difference, and the axiom that in the formula for identity, A equals A, the fact that you can materially space A from itself via an equal sign proves that A is identical, but these two A's are not the same. They're in a different place, for example. A differs from itself in the spatial context of its usage in the formula which shows this by splitting A into two, even when it cannot say it, as A is the same sound as A. We can show it, we can't say it. If we combine Wittgenstein's comment on the indiscernibility of the letter A as name for objects, Derrida's silent A in difference, and Heidegger's analysis, we come away with what Derrida describes as the pyramidical silence of the graphical difference between the E and the A in différence. The pyramid of silence is actually the silencing of what he calls the pyramidical structure of the sign, which through the course of the essay becomes deathly. He says the A of différence, therefore, is not heard. It remains silent, secret, discreet, like a tomb. The silence of the A's. And if anyone gets that reference to the silence of the lambs, probably because it's not very good. Neither metaphor is accidental, but the tomb in particular appears to engage with Blanchot's consideration of a petrific language, a stony language. That is the basis of Ranciere's really excellent study of modern Sigetic aestheticism, mute speech. The tomb-like element of language is what Blanchot calls the he/it, and later the neuter, and speaks to a silent generic nature of language and being. He says, the neuter in the singular names something that escapes nomination, but without making any noise, without even the noisiness of an enigma. We call it modestly, thoughtlessly, the thing. Now, this conception of the neuter matches precisely the logic of inceptual thinking as a means of solving the problem that language never has the flaw. Here, the neuter is the flaw, the pure taking place of language as such that is, by definition, according to everyone, silent. It names what escapes nomination because it constitutes nomination. It not only says the sayable, language as a generic medium, it also names the unnameable, or how language functions due to each of its units' names. That Blanchot calls the neuter the thing opens up an additional set of qualities one can find in the quietude of the neuter. The thing, he notes, like the he/it, like the neuter or the outside, indicates a plurality characterized by singularization itself and by appearing, by default, to rest in the indeterminate. It solves the paradox of Hegel's now. Like the he/it in Blanchot, the voice in Western thought is what Agamben calls a deictic shifter, using a term he takes from Roman Jakobson, to refer to an instance of language that shifts from a moment in discourse, I'm saying now, to an indicator of the fact that it is a discursive from an exterior position, he's saying now. His later work will rename this a signature, and instead of shifting, he will move to the term economy. Either way, Agamben is trying to access the movement from saying now, to an indication that this now refers to a singular moment and not some other generic now. And back again. The voice, for example, says something specific about you. It is your voice in the immediate sense, yet at the same time it mediates your essence through speaking it to others or yourself as a thinker. Agamben argues, a voice, a silent and unspeakable voice, is the supreme shifter, which permits thought to experience the taking place of language and to ground with it the dimension of being in its difference with respect to the entity. When you speak your authentic essence with an undifferentiated immediacy. Yet as soon as you say, I am, Derrida notes famously in signature event context, you commit your inner being to an externalized voice that defines the difference between self and other, that is, the essence of being. As such, this externality of being commits essence to the letter A, such that over time, others can use your name in your absence, leading to the rather mordant conclusion that when one speaks by saying, I am, one also admits to one's death by accepting, I also will not be. This is why the pyramid of being, that letter A, becomes our tomb. Death and Sigetics wander the petrified outside of being, hand in hand, silently singing a muted elegy. This problem, the basic problem of deconstruction, I would argue, relates directly to what is unspeakable in my voice, which is, of course, the voice itself. A voice cannot speak about the voice. It is my voice. It's not the voice. Yet it cannot stay silent about the voice. The fact that I can say I am makes being sayable, for example. We need that. This is why so many Sigetic thinkers turn to poetry, Agamben believes, because poetry, like philosophy, experiences, quote, the taking place of language as ungraspable and unspeakable, end of quote, as a material part of its essence, due to what he calls the metrical musical element. Meter, rhythm, and so on in a poem comes before language and meaning, composing a blank, indifferent yet differentiated structure, a picture of language as just pure rhythm, if you will, before that language has any specific meaning. It depicts, to use Wittgenstein's picture theory, what a language as pure medium for saying and thinking looks like before it is populated by specific thoughts and names. This observation was first made, I believe, again by Roman Jakobson. Rather than saying language and naming names, what the mute speech of modern poetry reveals, according to Ranciere at least, is that, quote, language does not reflect things, this is a really great quote, it expresses their relations. Mute speech, the neuter, therefore, accessible, say, through Hermetic poetry, Flaubert's book about nothing, and Blanchot's obscure prose, reveals the generic image of the relationality of a totally indifferent and content-neutral language across sayability and nameability. Each unit names a generic naming potential. Each combination reveals the generic overall relationality of a propositional saying in the purely abstract. The voice in poetry is revealing to those Sigetic philosophers on the outer edge of what can be thought said, because it is deictic and indicative before it is expressive or referential. It points to the here and now of expression as verso or verse, as returning, as generic, before it is the expression of the event of being. Here we arrive, therefore, at the relation between philosophical unsayability and poetic mysticism. I think Bataille sums it up best. He says, to manage to express silence verbally is to speak without saying anything. There are an infinite number of ways to do it, but the result is always the same, nothingness. That is why all authentic mystics have value. Inasmuch as they are authentically mystical, they speak of nothingness adequately. Odd choice of word at the end. I would have said amazingly, adequately. It is a common Sigetic position that Agamben, and I would have to say myself, comes to refute. He says, if this voice is the mystical foundation of our entire culture, only a liquidation of the mystical can open up a field to a thought or a language that speaks beyond the voice in its Sigetics. Poetry is not this field, but it does point to and pictures what it will look like, rather, for example, what it will say. The philosophy of Sigetics is hampered by what we can call the Sigetic paradox that demands, how can one speak of silence, yet how can one not speak of it? In essence, it's nothing more than a version of Russell's paradox, which states that there cannot exist a class of objects that both do and do not belong to that set at any one time. Fair enough. Speaking silence, say by using the sign silence or by writing a book about silence, is something wrong with that? I hope you can all feel that. If silence is the set of all things not said, then the saying of silence demands that saying silence be in that set as one of the things said. To be in the set, it must have a name, silence, that makes it sayable, yet the saying of silence cannot be in that set because saying is not silent, and it is the set of things that are silent. Conversely, if the saying of silence is not in the set silence, then we can't speak of silence because we can't think it, which suggests, of course, we can't compose a set of silent things. Without a set of silent things, because Sigetics is the discipline of what is sayable by philosophy by defining what is not, there is no such thing as philosophy, at least not as a form of saying, which I think is basically my unspoken conclusion. The best expression of this paradox, I suppose, is fittingly Heidegger's language never has the floor, repeated in various formats throughout the modern literature of Sigetics. Language, the mode of saying, can never say itself. Of course, this is not a statement about the unsayability of silence, but of language. This is because the Sigetic paradox is double. Not only can you not say silence, you also cannot not say silence. The same is true of language in the opposite direction. If language is the set of all the statements that make up language, that includes the statement that says what language is. Because if language is not sayable, that is made up of all the sentences of language, then what is it actually composed of? That sentence has got to be in there. Yet of all the things language can say, the one thing it cannot say, we're repeatedly told, is itself. Language then is unsayable, meaning it both belongs and does not belong to the set of language at the same time. This means language is the unsayable. I think it's Derrida who notes the silence of Saussure's langue. Yet the unsayability of language is unthinkable because, as we saw, that Sigetic paradox runs in both ways. Language is simultaneously unsayable, and yet this unsayable is sayable, which means it is in language, which is impossible, and so on and so forth, until eternity, in everything I've ever read on this topic. The performative exasperation is important here because this is a crux, I think, of where we're going with indifference. Agamben calls this eternal paradox of paradox, the metaphysical machine or economy. And his first full example of it is in terms of the voice and Sigetics in language and death. It's unsayable and sayable. It's silence and voice. And these ideas swap places so many times in that work that you forget which comes where, to the point that their oppositional difference becomes confused, suspended, undifferentiated. This is not you being stupid. This is Agamben's classic gesture, upgrading differential deconstruction with indifferential suspension. What is important here is the radical difference in Agamben's attitude to paradox, as that found, say, in Husserl, Gödel, and Wittgenstein, for example. They look to solve or avoid paradox, whereas Agamben demonstrates that the basic function of philosophy is to solve one paradox by the application of another paradox, which finds its solution in the first paradox, and so on and so forth forever. This is because philosophy is not defined by what it can think and say, but by the movement between two opposing things it cannot say through the application of something it can. Silence speaks. Contradiction 1. Language cannot speak itself. Contradiction 2. Silence therefore takes the place of language. It can now not speak, whatever that means. Language takes up silence's vacated position. It can now speak. Yet language as silence is also a contradiction, just as a voluble silence is meaningless. In other words, the sayability of philosophy is a distraction from its economy. Philosophy does not think or speak at all, really. It acts, it moves, it maintains, and from time to time, when you cannot remember, as I hope is the point we've arrived at now, the difference between silence and speaking, it falters. It is suspended, and a new possibility for thought presents itself. A kind of Wittgenstein moving picture theory. This new possibility, I argue, is a philosophy of indifference, of suspending these annoying paradoxical differences, but also of thinking after identity and difference. As such, it suggests a new kind of Sigetics, a silence located not at the origins or edges of what is thinkable, but a moment where the true unthinkability of thought, captured by problematic circularities like language never has the floor, is defined as philosophy's false organization around what is thinkable and what is sayable. Indifference silences metaphysics. It suspends its economy. It renders inoperative its conceptual machinery as a possibility of a new order of rational thought entirely we now call indifferential. It dampens the noise of the machine so that one can hear a true silence, one that is pre-divisive and post-suspension, a kind of reticent inceptualism. We can, I believe, draw a line between the two eras of continental thought. We've got the differential epoch defined by the performative Sigetics I'm calling deconstruction, which began with Hegel's issue with the now and found full expression in Heidegger, making philosophy speak its own unsayability. We've detailed that. And the indifferential era I think we now live in. This is perhaps typified by Ranciere and Badiou's rather different approach to the idea of philosophical inconsistency, or what thought cannot say, laid out in his neat little book, Wittgenstein's Anti-Philosophy, and in the essay, What is a Poem? Both texts concern themselves with what is outside of philosophy and how philosophical exteriority need not be unspeakable and paradoxical, as the tradition says, but in fact productive and truthful. Badiou explains that for thought to be thinkable, it needs to be consistent. Consistency is defined by him as having at least one statement that is impossible. All systems are incomplete, Gödel's incompleteness theorem, and if you try to complete them, they will be doubly paradoxical, as we've just seen Russell's paradox. Speaking of Wittgenstein's Sigetics, Badiou agrees with him that thought needs an outside. In order to think, you need that which cannot be thought. And as language is the medium of thought, that unthinkable element is the unsayable, which is also a foundational element, no thought without it, which is actually unfounding. It undoes all self-sufficient systems. The question is not, can one solve that paradox of incompletion? Nor is the task to simply show this paradox every time a system tries to dispense with it, which is a bit of the obsession of Derrida and Agamben, but to decide what the outside looks like. This decision is an ethical act of will, he thinks. It is, as is clear in Heidegger, Agamben, and Wittgenstein, a Sigetics that is as much an ethos, an ethics, as it is a logic. Indeed, it is the ethics of logic, Agamben himself says. The creation of Sigetics and its paradox is a 2 millennia long decision in terms of what cannot be said, thought, or founded, and perhaps the real unspeakable aspects of philosophy is that it is time to decide on a different externality for rational thought. For Badiou, in the history of philosophy, there are 2 unsayable zones which align neatly with the 2 modern traditions, the analytic tradition and the continental. These are mathematics and poetry. In terms of Gödel, he notes, consistency is precisely the unnameable point of mathematics, which is the essence of the incompleteness theory that Gödel's famous for. For Badiou, there is an outside of being which sets cannot say, which is that multiples are real before we collect them. He can't prove this, as to do so would be to use the language of sets, which would trespass into theorems of incompleteness and paradox, which he's not willing to do. Yet he argues that because one can name collections, then material multiples must precede this function. What about the poem? So the poem is unsayable in a different way. It brings something he calls power into language, quote. The power of the eternally fastening the disappearance of what presents itself. The power of producing presence itself as an idea. This power of language is precisely what the poem cannot name. It is, in other words, a name that does not name, or another one of those silent A's. It effectuates the infinity of language, but it can't name it, because to do so would, again, to contravene paradox and incompleteness, and he's not willing to do that. Badiou then presents a neat opposition between these 2 unnameables, or 2 silences. Maths, he says, is the unnameable of deductive consistency. It cannot say the basis of its own logic, it can only count due to it. Poetry instead names the unnameable of the medium of consistency, language. It cannot name the material base of thought. They're both instead performative showings of logic by counting, of language by singing. If Badiou does not differentiate, as I have done, between not being able to say and not being able to name, at the same time he does mark a distinction as regards 2 points of silence for thought. There is the logical limit and the linguistic. What cannot be thought, what cannot be said, they have different functions. For Badiou, therefore, there are 2 outsides of thought. The first is being itself. He calls this the void, the indifferent, the non-relational. This very much resembles Heidegger's inceptualism, as I said before. This outside, the reality of multiples before you are collecting them, shows thought that, quote, every system possesses a breaching point, a subtraction from the powers of the true. The incompleteness of mathematics in terms of set and their infinity proves that events, true external singularities, are possible, he argues. The exteriority of the poem pertains rather to the ability to name that event after it has occurred and then enter it into the annals of thought. As he says, quote, every naming of an event is in its essence poetic. Now this statement refers our attention to a peculiar section of his work on Wittgenstein as regards consistency, naming and the indiscernibility of the A. And I think it's perhaps inspired by Wittgenstein's famous comment in the 1940s, philosophy ought really to be written only as poetic composition. And Badiou considers the peculiar relation the poem has to the tautological naming of objects in Wittgenstein's propositions. He says, the poetic act is not descriptive, nor monstrative in the sense of the mystical element, and concludes, it aims rather to organize a verbal totality, a set. A poem by itself composes a proposition. Yet in order for the poem to compose a proposition, it must have names that extend over objects which can be confirmed with reference to the external world, analytic extensionalism. What possible truth could a poem state? Influenced now by Heidegger, he proffers that a presence of being is named in the poem that has no equivalent in ordinary or logical language. It is in effect a new name for a new being that comes into the presence in the moment of its being able to have a name. This leads to a rather astonishing burden for poetry. Quote, everything that participates in being, whether simple or infinitely multiple, has a name. The difficulty lies in inventing it. It is the bearing naming of poetry for being. Fascinating. Each poem, as a whole, Badiou argues, is a new name, in a manner that is the very opposite of Hegel's problem of the generic now. Hegel holds off from the obvious solution to the Russellian paradox of naming the now, which is to give each moment, each event, its own unique name, as he thinks that results in bad infinity and unthinkability. You probably do too. The whole point about the sayability of language is that it generalizes sense certainties thanks to certain abstract notions. For Badiou, however, the main issue with the tradition of the event, Hegel's nows, Heidegger's eregnis, Derrida's dates, Deleuze's rhizomes, and so on, is the assumption that events are so common that you couldn't possibly give them all a unique name. So you have to use like a generic marker, a datic name. This makes events sayable, yes, at the cost of making them unspecific, general, generic, indistinct, and paradoxically uneventful. If by way of contrast there are very few events, which he argues, why can't you have a unique name for each of them? And why can't that unique name be a poem? Such a poem doesn't name an external object, but in composing internal relations between multiples for the first time, it becomes an externality for the unique name. Through fidelity to the event via mathematics in the poem, the unsayable is transformed. And now we have a kind of new productive Sigetics. Wittgenstein assumed that there could be no new names because there could be no new objects, Badiou notes. In contrast, there can be new events. New things do happen in our worlds, new beings. And so the unsayable is not the limit of thought, it actually expands thinking. It's a new name. What is impossible, the event, suddenly becomes sayable through logical language and nameable through our poetry. So Badiou effectively changes the entire ethos of Sigetics here, and I think the tone. Philosophy can think and name the impossible exteriority of thought, which he calls the event, through sets and poems, such that what is unsayable for thought becomes sayable, very, very importantly, without paradox and with no problem as regards incompleteness. The outside of philosophy is not what it cannot say, just what it has not yet said. And the ethos, the decision, and the duty is to try and say and name this new externality. Sigetics becomes declamatory, loud, militant, celebratory. The silence of the unthinkable is transformed into the deafening clamour of being. And at this point, we should all leave the lecture theatre and build the hacienda, but we're not going to. It broke. So excited that it stopped functioning. If there were a collective noun for silences in English, I argue it would be the indifference of silences, because Sigetics, the philosophy of silence, is overburdened by a classic problem of indistinction. Silence, habitually, is defined in contradistinction to modes of naming, speaking, and thinking, which themselves entirely occupy the means of distinction and differentiation. Surrounding, opposing, hovering above, lurking below, and also, of course, located within and between is silence, the indistinct. Why is silence so irreducibly and incorrigibly indiscernible to our philosophy? Primarily because it operates as a horizon for differentiation and identity throughout the history of Western thought. Silence is what cannot be said by thought in language as a mode of identifying differences. Silence itself is indifferent. As we saw, Sigetics is the philosophy of silence as that which points to the outside of thought, expressed in language as the limit and definition of its consistency. This opens up the fields of Sigetics to its true essence, which is that silence is another name surely for indifference, indistinction, neutrality, contentlessness, and indiscernibility. Silence is everything philosophy cannot say. Silence is a philosophical inconsistency, which historically it always calls indifference. Sigetics is something I spoke of today, only to hold my counsel about it from this point on. That's a big lie I told last July, because I'm back doing the same talk. This is something of a relief, as Sigetics is marked by some basic characteristics that make it an impossible discipline. First, it defines silence as that which lacks definition, as an indistinct field from which it can carve out its own territory of distinction. Second, this means that there is a specific philosophical silence, which is, however, non-specific. This singular generic silence is bogged down by that annoying Sigetic paradox we looked at. Yet even away from the paradox of saying silence, we can see a basic contradiction, can we not? Sigetics defines silence as that which has no distinction, yet this distinguishes between Sigetics and all other thoughts, expressions, and experiences of silence, which are myriad. Even within philosophy, there are indistinct, yet real and discernible silences. Silence, for example, is located in different places. It's above and beyond in Wittgenstein. It's below and before in Heidegger. It's within yet without in Derrida. It is of different orders of magnitude. It is exterior and interior. It is a single wordless inexpressivity, as well as an internal semiotic marking of the syntactical concatenation of material expression, often with an irresistibly beautiful rhythm. These quantitative differences in silence contradict what silence is, because quantity denotes modes of distinguishing, an ability to measure and count silences, and these modes not only do not belong to silence, but they actually define philosophy and its negative relation to silence. Then again, once one has climbed the ladder, has retreated to the before distinction, all those different kinds of silences, the different qualities of not making noise, appear as varied and differential as the modes of making noise. And philosophers can't resist listening to these different qualities of the unspeakability of the silence that is not theirs. You have the silence of stone, of death, the quiet inner voice, the muteness of speech, the hushed nature of the written, the inaudibility of the object, the stifled flow of language, the speechless power of the poem, the murmur of the neuter. Thus, the silence that belongs to thought, Sigetics, is different in quantity, and the silence that is improper to thought is appropriated by thought to kind of give colour and meaning to Sigetic impropriety. Here, my collective noun, the indifference of silence, which is itself a paradox, silence is indistinct, and a truth, philosophy is defined by at least one proposition it cannot say, that impossible proposition which makes philosophy possible, Sigetics, which is also the impossibility of a certain kind of philosophy that I want us to move away from, what we're calling the philosophy of difference, that has slowly been silenced during this century by a new thinking of indistinction, which is not at all hampered by the paradox of Sigetics, because it's not concerned with language and expression as much as numbers and their collection. This is the silence of sects. Indifference is the collective noun for silence, which itself is an essential feature of collection. When we gather in silence. We do not name, we do not speak. Collecting is a silent pursuit, over time also a tedious one. Perhaps we began by humming, by rhythmical notation. I'm going to get this and this and this and this to pass the time. Maybe over time that became counting. Either way, the collection function is more believable as the silent mythical predecessor of the naming function that so obsesses all our philosophers. The link between collecting and naming is perhaps the deictic shift that Agamben calls the voice. Quine concurs but misses the point, so to speak. Words don't indicate objects, but signal community. Hence, Quine's famous theory of the indetermination of translation. It's obvious, surely, that speaking pointing is a secondary derived function of gathering. The hand, when gathering, cannot point, it's full of fruit. This indicative mode is presented as part of the gathering picture. Look, I am gathering is a derived function of actual gathering that is included in gathering in real time. Look, we are gathered is the social picture of language before we are able, as a gathered people, to say, look over there, a rabbit, kill it. As humans, we look before we speak, and all looking is collecting. Language is less a form of pointing, therefore, than a derivation from collecting. The role of the name is not to refer, but to collect. Even the social role of language, as Ranciere says, has a pictorial aspect. He says it resembles the social function rather than describes or represents it. It looks like society. It doesn't tell you it's society. Quine, controversially, agrees. As Nancy and Christopher explain, the purpose of the myths of our tribe is not to say anything. Myth, from the Greek for mute, but to collect. The poet, the shaman, and the storyteller makes a set of people gather round, listen. This set is composed of nonsensical content. Myths are not true, but their saying is true because what they compose is the correct picture, the correct structural relation. We beings, in common, gathered together. Poems make us into sets and, as names composed of contentless, yet differentiated rhythmical units, they are also sets. All the words in a sonnet are all the same kinds of words, whichever sonnet you read. They are the sonnet composing words that refer to their place in the sonnet, not the sonnet's relation to the external world. Poems are composed of indiscernible, yet physically distinct A's and B's. We call those stressed and unstressed syllables. We have no problem with it. From this basic function of collection, multiple elements of indifferential collections explain and dispel this Sigetic paradox, leaving us with collection, the arch ontological function, those gathered multiplicities of silence. Oh, I would say more, but the curfew tolls the knell of passing day, leaving the world to silence and to me, and my spirit ditties of no tone. Go now in peace, be as one body, and tell no one of this. Thank you.